Brothers and sisters, let me ask you, how many times have you found yourself in a struggle so deep, a challenge so overwhelming that you felt there was no way out? You tried everything, every plan, every strategy, and yet nothing seemed to work. But then there comes a moment when you realize that the best thing you can do is not to fight harder, not to wrestle with your circumstances, but to simply let go. The most powerful thing about letting God handle it is that it brings you into a space of peace that transcends all understanding. We live in a world that constantly pushes us to take control. From the moment we wake up to the time we lay our heads down, there's this underlying pressure to always be in charge, to manage every aspect of our lives. We feel responsible for everything: our jobs, our relationships, our dreams, our futures. We think that if we don't hold onto the wheel, things will spiral out of control and we'll lose everything. But here's the truth. Trying to control every detail can actually lead to burnout and frustration. There's a profound strength in recognizing that we don't have to carry the weight of the world alone. The moment we admit that we can't handle it all, we open the door for God to step in. And that's where real power begins. When you let go of your need to control every outcome, every step, every turn in your life, you allow room for God's power to move in ways you never imagined. We often think that being in control means being strong, but real strength comes from the ability to surrender, from the courage to trust that God knows what's best for us, even when we can't see the bigger picture. When you let go, you stop trying to manipulate situations to fit your own expectations. Instead, you step into a place of trust, allowing God to work in His perfect way and time. This doesn't mean that you become passive or complacent. It means that you trust God with the outcomes, knowing He has a plan greater than your own. It means stepping into a posture of faith, saying, I don't have to figure everything out. I don't have to have all the answers. I'm giving this over to God because He's got it handled. In that surrender, you discover a deeper level of peace, one that surpasses the anxiety that comes from trying to control everything yourself. It's a peace that doesn't come from the absence of problems, but from the assurance that you're not facing them alone. When you allow God to handle it, you stop carrying burdens that were never meant for you to bear, and you allow His power to move in your life in ways that only He can. That's the real freedom in surrender. It's not about giving up, it's about giving it all to the one who can handle it. We often find ourselves trapped in the rush of life, moving from one thing to the next, trying to make everything fit our own timeline. We want things to happen quickly, according to our plans and desires, and when they don't, we get frustrated. We tell ourselves that if we just work harder, push further, or manipulate the circumstances enough, we can make things fall into place. But here's the reality. Our timing is limited, and it's rarely as perfect as we think it is. God's timing, on the other hand, is flawless. We can't see the full picture because our vision is narrow, but He sees everything, the past, present, and future. He knows exactly when the right doors will open and when we need to be in the right place at the right time. When we let God handle it, we're not just trusting Him to work things out, we're trusting that He knows the best timing for everything in our lives. What feels like a delay in our eyes may actually be God setting things up in ways we don't understand. Have you ever noticed that the hardest things to wait for are often the things that turn out to be the most important? When we rush through life, we miss the depth of what God is trying to teach us in each season. We may think we're ready for something, but God, in His infinite wisdom, knows when we're truly prepared. He knows when we're ready to step into the next chapter of our lives, when we have grown enough Spiritually, emotionally, and mentally, it's not about our timeline. It's about the process he's taking us through, preparing us for what's to come. What feels like a setback is often God's way of keeping us from making a mistake, or worse, getting into something that's not in line with his plan for us. There is a reason for every season of waiting. Every time we feel like we're stuck, we have to remember that even in the quiet moments, God is working. He's moving things around behind the scenes, orchestrating situations, aligning people, and opening doors at just the right time. When we trust that God's timing is perfect, we're not just letting go of our need to control the outcome. We're surrendering the schedule. We're saying, God, I trust that you know exactly when the right things will happen. I don't have to rush it. I don't have to force it. I just need to trust that you're going to make it happen in your time, not mine. That's when we stop worrying about the clock and start resting in the peace of knowing that the right things are coming, and they are coming at the right moment. Faith and fear are often at odds. They are two forces that battle for control over our thoughts, our decisions, and our actions. Fear makes itself known in many ways in the form of anxiety, doubt, worry, and the constant questioning of whether things will work out. It whispers to us that we aren't enough, that the odds are too great, and that we're walking into failure. It convinces us that the road ahead is filled with nothing but obstacles, and it paralyzes us from moving forward. On the other hand, faith tells us something different. Faith speaks a truth that transcends the circumstances and the fear that's trying to hold us back. Faith says, you are not alone in this. There is a God who is bigger than your fear, bigger than your challenges, and who has already prepared the way for you. When we let God handle it, we're choosing to lean into that faith, even when fear screams louder. The most powerful thing about letting God handle it is that it forces us to choose faith over fear, to make the decision to trust him even when we don't understand, even when the road looks uncertain. Fear tells us to give up before we even start, to play it safe, and to settle for what seems achievable. But faith pushes us to move beyond the limits of what we can see, to step out into the unknown and trust that God has already gone ahead of us. Letting God handle it doesn't mean that fear won't arise. It doesn't mean that we won't feel those moments of uncertainty. What it means is that in the face of fear, we choose to stand firm in the promises of God, knowing that he is greater than the storm. When we give God control, we don't allow fear to drive us to panic. Instead, we allow his peace to reign in our hearts, guiding us even through the most fearful situations. It's easy to trust when everything is going well, when the path is clear, and when there are no obstacles in sight. But faith is tested in the dark times, in the moments when fear seems louder than hope. That's when we have to remind ourselves that fear is not the voice we follow, faith is. Faith is the force that propels us forward even when our natural instinct is to shrink back. When we allow God to handle it, we're not ignoring the fear, we're acknowledging that his strength is more than enough to carry us through whatever comes our way. The powerful shift happens when we stop allowing fear to dictate our next move, and instead we let faith take the lead. Fear would have you believe that you can't do it, that you're not capable, that you're going to fail. But faith tells you you are more than a conqueror. You are equipped, you are able, and with God you will prevail. When we make the decision to let God handle it, we're choosing to trust his plan and power over our own limitations, knowing that the outcome, no matter how it looks in the moment, is in his hands. Faith becomes the anchor that steadies us through every storm, and in the end we realize that fear has no place in a life surrendered to God. When we face difficulties in life, it's easy to believe that we are the ones who need to fix everything. We often think that if we just try harder or if we just give a little more of ourselves, we'll be able to solve the problems on our own. But what happens when our best efforts don't bring the healing or resolution we expect? What happens when the scars, whether physical or emotional, still remain after we've done everything in our power? This is where the true power of letting God handle it comes in. It's not just about fixing the situation, it's about God healing what's broken within us. And sometimes we need to release control for that healing to begin. When we let God take over, we invite him into the places that need restoration. The places that we've tried to cover up, the places where we've carried hurt and disappointment for too long. Healing is not just about the external circumstances changing. It's about God working deeply in our hearts, mending what has been broken and bringing restoration to our spirits. This is a healing that goes beyond physical wounds. It's the healing of the soul. It's the healing of our emotions, our relationships, and the very things that have caused us to doubt our worth. We often underestimate how much damage life's trials can do to our inner world. Pain, betrayal, disappointment, they all leave their marks, and sometimes those marks don't heal simply by time passing. Sometimes the wounds go deeper than we can address on our own. We might try to move on, to bury the pain, or to push through with a smile, but the truth is, some scars can only be healed by God's touch. When we allow God to handle it, he doesn't just deal with the surface, he goes beneath into the depths of our hearts, and he brings true healing, healing that doesn't just mask the pain, but completely restores us. Sometimes restoration means releasing things we didn't even know we were holding on to. Maybe it's unforgiveness. Maybe it's a dream that didn't come true. Or maybe it's a mistake that we can't let go of. These are the things that weigh us down and prevent us from moving forward. When we give God control, he begins the process of restoration by helping us let go of the very things we've been carrying. Things that were never meant for us to carry alone. And as we let go, he begins to do what only he can do. He heals, he restores, and he makes all things new. There's a kind of healing that happens when we surrender. The weight that we've been carrying is lifted off, and we realize that we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to have everything figured out, and we don't have to be in control. God is able to work in the places where we've given up on ourselves. He's able to mend the parts of our heart that we've closed off. It's not just about solving a problem or fixing a situation. It's about God working to restore the parts of us that we may have neglected or thought were beyond hope. In the process of letting God handle it, he does more than just bring resolution to our external situations. He heals us from the inside out, restoring our faith, renewing our hearts, and giving us strength to move forward with a renewed sense of purpose and wholeness. This kind of healing doesn't just touch one area of your life, it touches everything. And it's this restoration that allows us to stand stronger than we were before, because we've been healed by the one who knows us better than we know ourselves. When we are at our weakest, when life has knocked us down, and when we feel as though we have nothing left to give, that is when God's strength is most evident in our lives. We often think that our ability to overcome challenges is tied to our own strength, that we need to push through every difficulty with sheer willpower. But the truth is, there are times when we simply don't have the strength to keep going. That's the moment when we need to understand that God's strength doesn't come from us. It flows from him, and it is made perfect in our weakness. It's in the moments of surrender When we acknowledge that we can't handle it on our own, that we allow God's strength to rise within us. This isn't a strength that we can manufacture or summon from within ourselves. It's a divine strength that is provided by God when we step aside and let Him take the lead. When we let God handle it, we don't have to rely on our own abilities. Instead, we trust in His power to carry us through what we could never overcome on our own. This kind of strength is different from the strength the world teaches us to rely on. The world tells us to push through, to never show weakness, to keep fighting with all our might. But the Bible teaches us that when we are weak, then we are strong, because it is in those moments that we become fully dependent on God's power, and that's when His strength is revealed. God's power is not limited by our weaknesses. In fact, it is often in our vulnerability that His power shines the brightest. When we admit that we cannot handle it, we make room for God to do what only He can do. This strength is not just about enduring hardships, it's about overcoming them with the peace that comes from knowing that we're not in this fight alone. God's strength empowers us to keep moving, even when we feel like giving up. It gives us the endurance to continue through the storms of life, to stand firm when everything around us is shaking. The more we let go and trust in God's strength, the more we realize that what seemed impossible is actually within reach, because it's not our strength we're depending on, it's His. There is a power that comes from God's strength that we simply cannot understand until we're in the midst of our own weakness. It is in the moments when we feel like we're at our lowest that God's power is able to work in us and through us. It's like the old saying, when you're down to nothing, God is up to something. When we let go of the illusion that we can handle everything ourselves, we open ourselves up to the supernatural strength that God provides. We tap into a power that goes beyond anything we could imagine. And in that strength, we find the courage to face challenges, the wisdom to make decisions, and the ability to rise again when we've fallen. The beauty of this strength is that it doesn't fade or diminish with time, it only grows. The more we trust God with our battles, the more we rely on His power, the more we realize that His strength is infinite. We can face anything because we know that in our weakness, God's strength is not just a temporary fix. It's a permanent source of power that never runs dry. When we allow God to handle it, we are no longer bound by our limitations. We tap into the limitless power of the Creator, and in that, we find an inner strength that carries us through the most difficult moments of our lives. Obedience is often seen as a passive act, something we do because we are told to or because we're trying to avoid trouble. But in reality, obedience to God is one of the most powerful acts of faith we can take. When we choose to let God handle it, we are stepping into a place of obedience that aligns us with His will, His purpose, and His power. Obedience doesn't just mean following instructions. It's about surrendering our own desires, our own plans, and our own understanding to follow God's lead. And in that obedience, there is a power that transforms not only our situation, but also ourselves. Obedience requires trust. It's easy to obey when we understand the why, when we can see the end result, or when things are going smoothly. But when life gets difficult and God asks us to take steps that don't make sense, that's when our faith is tested. That's when we have to choose whether we will follow God's voice or let our doubts and fears guide us. But when we choose to obey, even when we don't have all the answers, we open ourselves up to God's supernatural provision and intervention. God's plan for our lives is far greater than our own. Often we get so caught up in trying to figure things out ourselves, trying to control the outcome and trying to make things happen in our own strength, that we forget that God is already ahead of us, working things out for our good. Obedience is the key that unlocks the door to that plan. When we obey, we are allowing God to go before us, clearing the path and making a way where there seems to be no way. We may not understand everything, but in our obedience, we place our trust in the one who knows the end from the beginning. In the act of letting God handle it, obedience also brings peace. We often struggle with anxiety and stress because we feel responsible for everything, trying to manage it all ourselves. But when we obey, we release that burden. We stop trying to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders and trust that God has already won the battle. Obedience is not about passivity. It's about actively choosing to align ourselves with God's will, knowing that when we do, we are walking in His power and His grace. The victory comes not when we fight our battles alone, but when we let God fight them for us. Obedience is where the victory lies. It's when we say, God, I'll follow your lead, even if the road is uncertain or the challenges seem overwhelming. God's strength is made perfect in our obedience. It is through our willingness to obey, to trust Him, and to follow His guidance that we see breakthroughs. When we let God handle it, we stop relying on our own strength and wisdom, and instead we rely on His. And it's in that reliance, that obedience, that we see God move in ways we could never have imagined. The victory is already set, but our obedience unlocks the path to experiencing it fully. In the end, the most powerful thing about letting God handle it is not about surrendering to a life of inaction. It's about stepping into a life of divine partnership. It's realizing that we are not alone, that we don't have to fight the battles, bear the burdens, or make all the decisions on our own. God is with us, guiding us, empowering us, and healing us in ways we could never achieve through our own strength. When we let go, when we trust, when we obey, we open ourselves to a life that is rich with His presence, His power, and His grace. So let us choose to surrender control. Let us trust God with our futures, our hearts, our struggles, and our victories. Let us walk in faith, knowing that God has it all in His hands, and His plans for us are good. Thank you. Thank you for listening, for being open to the possibility of letting go and letting God. May you walk in His peace and His power every step of the way. God bless you.